The silver wings around Ben's neck caught the washed-out fluorescent light as he tightened the final bolt on the jet's engine. He was only 17, but his hands had the steady confidence of someone who'd poured hours into studying the blueprints of every aircraft he could find at the Kennedy hangar. He worked through the night, eyes stinging from exhaustion, but his mind refused to slow down. This jet, worth millions and written off by the older mechanics as a lost cause, now hummed softly, almost as if it too hoped for another chance to fly. Ben could feel the weight of the moment, a quiet challenge he was determined not to lose. Just as he wiped the grease from his hands, the deep echo of footsteps broke the silent rhythm of early morning. Turning, Ben recognized Daniel Ross, the CEO of Kennedy Air, unmistakable in his sharp suit and the seriousness he carried. Daniel's focus wasn't on the plane, surprising Ben. Instead, his gaze lingered on the pendant resting just above Ben's collarbone. For a moment, neither spoke. The silent connection between the silver wings and the man's thoughtful stare filled the air with a new kind of tension, a mix of company worries and something unspoken, tied to the past. In that instant, Ben realized their lives might be tangled together by more than a simple engine repair, as if both their futures hovered in the balance, waiting for those wings to decide the next step. Daniel's tone cut through the hum of the hangar. "How soon will she be ready?" he demanded, eyes darting from the jet to the clock above the office door. "We have board members landing in less than 2 hours. That jet absolutely has to fly." Ben, still catching his breath, stood his ground. "She's good to go," he replied, his voice steady but respectful. He quickly explained the steps he'd taken, how he'd rerouted the circuit panel to bypass the damaged wiring, how he tested the controls manually and checked the diagnostics twice just to be sure. Ben described what he'd built and rebuilt, even though Daniel's doubtful glance never left him. The CEO's skepticism lingered, not just because Ben was so young, but because he wasn't used to trusting someone outside his usual circle, let alone a 17-year-old who'd only recently finished his technical training. However, just as Daniel seemed ready to brush him off, his eyes landed on the silver pendant again. In a heartbeat, his rigid posture softened and his voice lowered. "Where did you get those wings?" he asked, almost absent-mindedly. The question hung in the air, signaling a sudden shift. Ben hesitated, surprised the conversation wasn't about the engine anymore. Instead, Daniel quietly shared a story, one about a rescue during the Vietnam War, a debt never repaid, and the same wings that symbolized heroism and connection between their families. Ben realized as Daniel spoke that fixing the jet was just the surface. Old stories, sacrifice, and fate had drawn them both here for much bigger reasons. Just a few hours earlier, Ben had trudged across the soaked concrete of the Kennedy Air maintenance yard, his sneakers squelching with every tired step. It had rained steadily all night, and the gray sky still hung low over New York City, making everything feel heavier. He was finishing what felt like his 100th shift that week, eyes half closed, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Linda, the head of maintenance, telling him to get back to the hangar now. He barely had time to gulp a cup of vending machine coffee before stepping into the vast, echoing hangar where tension practically crackled in the air. The usual crew was there, all grumbling about the jet that no one believed could fly again. At the center, Ed, a grizzled old mechanic with more years behind him than most of the others combined, shot Ben a look that said he didn't expect much. Probably. Figured Ben was only there to fetch wrenches and stay out of the way. But instead of speaking up, Ben watched and listened, catching details other people missed and piecing together what might be really wrong with the jet. With every subtle sound and blink on the diagnostic screen, an idea started taking shape, a risky theory that everyone else had overlooked. While the experts clustered around the engine, shaking their heads and muttering about waiting days for new parts from overseas, Ben quietly traced the lines of the circuit panels with a flashlight. Everyone else seemed ready to give up. Ed was especially vocal, insisting that nothing could be done without a shipment from Germany and that even trying was a waste of time. To everyone else, Ben was just the kid who asked too many questions, not someone worth listening to during a crisis. But Ben couldn't let it go. He remembered pages from old repair manuals he used to borrow from the library and hours spent on flight simulators in his uncle's basement, learning how certain patterns of failure usually signaled problems with calibration, not broken parts. He cleared his throat and suggested trying a manual recalibration instead of waiting for parts. Ed snorted and muttered, "Let the boy play mechanic," turning away before Ben had finished his sentence. Linda hesitated, weighing her options. Finally, she shrugged and told Ben, "You've got one night. Knock yourself out." Everyone cleared out, leaving the huge hangar eerily quiet. As Ben rolled up his sleeves and spread out the battered service manuals, he couldn't help but feel the pressure of proving himself, not just to the team, but for the sake of the legacy symbolized by the wings resting against his chest. Just hours crawled by as Ben worked through the long night, his breath misting in the chill of the empty hangar. He moved from one panel to the next, careful as he loosened wires and connected them again, then checked digital readings against the tattered old notebooks he'd brought from home. Each time he ran into a snag, he pictured his grandfather leaning over an engine back in the day, telling stories about tough jobs and even tougher bosses. Ben muttered questions out loud, almost hearing the old man's steady voice in reply, guiding him to look twice or try a different tool. The silver wings around his neck felt heavier with every hour. They weren't just jewelry, but a reminder he carried hope and history both. Just as the sky outside started to turn from dark to a hazy blue, Ben powered up the jet's systems. One last time. Everything hummed to life, lights flickering in perfect sequence. The system's dashboard readouts were clear, all green. Ben leaned back, feeling a wave of relief flood over him. He'd done it. Tomorrow, when the rest of the team came in, they'd find the aircraft repaired and ready. More important, Ben knew he'd finally proved himself worthy of the wings he wore, no matter if anyone else noticed or not. As the first rays of morning filtered through the windows, Ben wiped his hands with a shop rag and blinked against the brightness. He turned as Daniel walked in, his stride quick but a little uncertain now that the rumors had spread. When Daniel's eyes landed on the jet, humming perfectly, surprise flickered across his face before he composed himself. For a moment, Daniel seemed ready to launch straight into business, but then he hesitated, glancing again at the silver wings on Ben's chest. Linda, who had arrived early, filled Daniel in on what had happened overnight, how Ben had worked, without stopping, and done what no one else thought possible. Daniel seemed taken aback, even more so when Ben quietly mentioned the story linked to the pendant he wore. Slowly, the blunt edge faded from the CEO's manner. Daniel finally asked about Ben's grandfather, piecing together details until the old story came out. Back in the Second World War, Ben's grandfather had pulled Daniel's father from a burning tank in France. It was a story both families had quietly held on to. Suddenly, the entire atmosphere in the hangar shifted. Where there had been only deadlines and skepticism before, now an old, shared experience created something gentler, a sense of respect, and the feeling that sometimes the past must be honored before moving forward. The silver wings now seemed to shine a little brighter, the quiet link between two families finally recognized in the early New York sunlight. The sound of footsteps and voices echoed through the hangar, pulling everyone's attention back to the present. Linda came in first, followed closely by Ed, who looked more tired than usual, but still managed to keep his usual skeptical frown. Spotting Daniel and Ben talking quietly, Ed rolled his eyes, then paused as Daniel turned to address everyone with an authority that quieted the entire room. Without hesitating, Daniel spoke up so the whole crew could hear him. "Ben is the reason that Jet is flying today," he said firmly. "From now on, any disrespect or dismissal directed at him or anyone else based on their age or background will have serious consequences." There was a heavy silence, with a few surprised faces and more than one sideways glance in Ed's direction. Linda just nodded, clearly proud. This moment wasn't just about a single repair job anymore. Daniel's words made it clear that the company would no longer tolerate the old ways of brushing aside younger workers or letting bias slide by. Ben could actually feel something shift, almost like the pressure he'd lived with until now was starting to ease up. For the first time, surrounded by colleagues who finally noticed him, he believed that not only had he earned his place, but maybe he could help others find theirs too. Later that morning, as the noise in the hangar faded back to the usual busy hum, Daniel called Ben aside. "Let's head to my office for a bit," he said, leading the way to a glass-walled room overlooking the runway at Kennedy. Sunlight streamed through the windows, landing on files and stacks of yellowed envelopes spread across Daniel's desk. Daniel gestured for Ben to sit, then carefully opened a box and pulled out old photos showing two young men in faded uniforms grinning beside an old prop plane. "My dad and your grandfather," Daniel said with a small smile. They went through the stack together, paging through black and white snapshots, postcards sent between New York and Boston, crumpled letters and clippings from the New York Times. There were stories in every faded page, their grandfathers swapping dreams of building an American flight school together, talking about making opportunities for anyone who wanted to learn. Ben's chest tightened as Daniel read out loud from a letter his own father had kept for years but never shared. In those pages, Ben's grandfather explained his decision to turn down launching the school, worried that stirring things up would put his family at risk in those uncertain years after the war. Sitting in Daniel's office, Ben finally understood that his legacy wasn't only about bravery and fixing what was broken. It was also about the quiet strength to keep others safe and the dreams left unfinished. As Daniel sorted through the last few letters and tucked them back in their envelopes, he looked Ben in the eye and began to explain the next step. "Ben, there's something else," he said, his tone both warm and serious. He handed over a letter on crisp stationery, stamped with the mark of the National Aviation Foundation, a group Ben knew only from news articles and the occasional TV segment. Daniel explained that, thanks to donations and with the support from his own company, the foundation wanted to offer Ben a full scholarship, guaranteed internship placements, and a direct path into aeronautical engineering after graduation. It was everything Ben had wished for while tinkering with engines in the garage after school, but always felt too far out of reach. Daniel made it clear the offer was about more than just rewarding Ben's hard work the night before. It was also about passing on the dreams that both their families once shared and repairing something lost along the way. Ben sat quietly for a while, his mind racing with excitement and real questions. He wondered if his opportunity had strings attached, or if it came only because of family history and yesterday's heroics. For just a moment, Ben felt dizzy, thinking about what it would mean to accept the gift, and if he could really live up to both the promise and the responsibility that came with it. Ben left the office carrying the letter and the weight of the offer on his shoulders. When he got home to his apartment in Queens, just after sunset, his grandmother, Mary, was sitting at the kitchen table sorting through a box of knitting yarn. The look on her face shifted from curiosity to cautious hope. As Ben shared the news, stumbling over some words, unable to hide how nervous and excited he was, he placed the scholarship letter gently in front of her, watching her eyes move over the words. Mary listened in silence before she reached out and squeezed Ben's hand. She told him how proud she was, how his grandfather, Frank, would have grinned from ear to ear to see Ben reaching for something new. Then her voice softened with worry. She started to describe how, years ago, Frank had turned down big chances and stayed out of the spotlight, especially when offers came from important, well-connected people. It was not because he lacked ambition, but out of concern for the family's safety and future. "Ben, you're talented, smart and honest," Mary said, "but people in power don't always give something for nothing. Promise me you'll look at this from every angle before making up your mind." Her warning hung between them, the truth in her words bringing up old stories and quiet sacrifices, reminding Ben that the decision he faced would shape more than just his own path. With Mary's words still echoing in his mind, Ben found himself restless that night, unable to shake the feeling that there was more to his family's story than he had ever understood. Sifting through an old family album for clues, he came across a faded photo with a note mentioning his grandfather's younger brother, Sam. Ben remembered vague family talk about a falling out, but he had never met this mysterious great-uncle or heard the full story behind their split. Curiosity mixed with longing, Ben spent the next day searching online and making a few careful phone calls. He found a thread. A neighbor in Chicago remembered an old mechanic named Sam who used to run a repair shop on the South Side years ago. The idea of meeting someone who might fill in the missing parts of Frank's past felt important, even if it meant traveling halfway across the country. A week later, Ben boarded an early train out of Penn Station, heading for Illinois, nerves buzzing in his stomach. Gazing out at the rolling fields of Pennsylvania and Ohio, he pictured what Sam might be like and what secrets or advice he could share. Ben hoped that connecting with Sam would bring together the scattered pieces of his family's legacy and maybe help him see the path ahead more clearly. Ben finally found Sam's auto shop on a quiet street in the south side of Chicago, its windows cluttered with hand-painted signs and old sports posters. Inside, the air smelled of oil and metal, and Sam, a wiry man with grey hair and steady hands, looked up from a carburetor, sizing Ben up with sharp, curious eyes. Once Ben introduced himself and shared a bit of Frank's old story, Sam softened a little and waved him into a back office filled with faded photos and dusty books. Over mugs of coffee, Sam took his time, sharing memories, talking about how Frank had come back from the Second World War, changed and cautious. Sam described the frustration pounding through their lives as discrimination at work and in their neighborhood held them back. Frank, Sam said, chose a quiet path, always trying to protect the family, blending in and keeping out of trouble. Sam, on the other hand, had tried to push back. He confronted bosses, wrote letters and argued loudly for fairness, even when it meant trouble or lost jobs. Their choices led to arguments and finally to the family drifting apart. Sitting there, Ben realized these moments weren't just old family drama. They were difficult decisions made in imperfect times, sacrifices, balancing safety and pride, each with its own cost. He understood now that each generation faced risk, and while the answers changed, the struggle to choose between standing up and laying low still shaped what he would do next. After hours of stories and honest talk, Sam leaned forward, his voice dropping to a serious tone. He looked Ben in the eye and said, "You know, offers like the one you got from Daniel can be a double-edged sword. Sure, they sound like a chance to set things right, but companies like his don't just hand out scholarships and internships with no expectation in return. Sometimes they use our stories to polish their own image or fix something in the past. You have to make them work for you, not the other way around." Sam was clear. Ben should take the opportunity, but only if he could make sure it led to something bigger for others, not just himself. Ben listened, taking in the wisdom that came from years of seeing how powerful people shaped the world around them. By the end of the visit, he was no longer thinking about the scholarship as just a ticket out, but as a real chance to do some good. On the train ride back to New York, Ben felt steadier. He was done being passive about his future or his family's story. If he took this offer, he would demand transparency, push for programs to open doors for kids like him, and make sure the legacy of the Silver Wings represented both resilience and real change. Back in Manhattan, Ben scheduled a meeting with Daniel, determined that this conversation would be different from the first. They met at a small cafe near Bryant Park, where the city buzzed quietly outside the window. Ben wasted no time. He spoke openly about his family's history, the pain and pride passed down through the generations, and the fresh perspective he had gained after seeking out Sam. He made it clear he knew the offer was about more than paying back a debt or giving one kid a break. It held the weight of both opportunity and responsibility. Then Ben laid out his terms. He wanted control over how his story was used, making sure his name and experiences would not be turned into a marketing campaign without his say. More importantly, he asked Daniel and the National Aviation Foundation to create a scholarship fund that would open doors for more students from neighborhoods like his, not just as a one-time gesture, but as a lasting commitment. Daniel, at first, taken aback by Ben's confidence, listened closely and saw just how much Ben had grown. Instead of resisting, Daniel agreed. He promised that the foundation would follow through. Ben's demands would become part of something bigger. As they shook hands, it marked not just the beginning of a new future for Ben, but a reimagined understanding between their families, turning decades of pain and hope into a partnership for real change. Shortly after the agreement with Daniel, Ben was invited to the National Aviation Foundation's headquarters for an orientation session. The sleek, glass-walled building in Cienfuegos Midtown felt both intimidating and exciting, but Ben was quickly put at ease when he was introduced to Angela Harris, a leading engineer and new program mentor. Angela had grown up in Detroit and worked her way up in a field with very few faces. Like hers, breaking barriers and never forgetting the people who had helped along the way. Their first conversation was honest and encouraging. Angela shared some of her own experiences, times when she had to push harder than others, times she made mistakes, and moments of pride when her work led to real progress. Ben realized he was not walking this road alone. There were others who had come before him and were reaching back to lift new voices. Angela emphasized the value of building a support network, reminding him that nobody builds a legacy by themselves. Together, they started brainstorming what Ben's next few years could look like, not only in terms of engineering projects, but also community outreach and leadership. For the first time, Ben felt the weight of history lift a little. He knew he could carry his family's story forward, not by repeating the past, but by forging his own path, supported by those who understood both the struggle and the potential. As the months turned into years, Ben settled into his life at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a place he'd once only dreamed of. Immersed in classes and late-night lab work, his passion for aviation systems deepened. He and a small team of fellow students developed a new lightweight control chip for commercial airplanes that could help cut fuel usage and boost safety. When their prototype was tested in a simulator and worked flawlessly, it made waves across campus and caught the attention of engineers from both Boston and abroad. Soon, Ben was fielding calls from news outlets and invitations to speak at conferences. Even the folks who had doubted someone from his background could make it this far now wanted his insight. Through it all, his relationship with Daniel changed. There was a growing sense of respect between them, but Ben never let his guard fully down. He had learned to watch out for shifting motives in the business world. Sometimes decisions at the foundation made Ben uneasy, and he leaned on Angela Harris for advice. remembering her words about protecting one's values in a setting where not everyone wanted outsiders to succeed. Angela remained a steady mentor, celebrating Ben's breakthroughs, but reminding him that real change, both in technology and in culture, moved slowly. She helped him see that his achievements could open doors for others, not just himself, and that staying true to his roots was as important as any trophy or headline. One crisp October afternoon, while Ben was at the lab tweaking the latest prototype, he was told there was a visitor waiting for him in the conference room. He expected maybe a professor or a journalist, but instead found Robert Thompson, the elderly patriarch of the Thompson family, the same family that had once been intertwined with his grandfather's own story back in Chicago. The old man walked with a cane, but stood tall, his presence quiet yet commanding. The lab's usual hum faded into the background as Robert handed Ben a worn envelope, its edges yellowed with age. Robert explained softly that the letter had been written by Frank, Ben's grandfather, all those years ago. It was meant for Robert's father, but had never been delivered. The words inside, he said, had remained locked away as both families drifted apart over misunderstandings and time. Robert, with a tremble in his voice, said he hoped that giving the letter to Ben now might finally help bridge the gap the past had left behind. Ben was stunned, his hands shaking slightly as he accepted the letter. He realized this was more than just an old piece of paper. It was a doorway into feelings and intentions that had never found daylight. This fragile connection across generations suddenly felt vital for understanding not only where he came from, but what his responsibility as a carrier of this legacy truly was. As Ben carefully tucked the old letter into his bag, Robert lingered as if he had something more to say. After a quiet moment, Robert revealed a story Ben had never heard before, one that felt almost too extraordinary to be real. Robert explained that during the Korean War, Ben's great-uncle Louis had been part of a covert rescue mission. Almost. No one outside the family had known about his service. On one dangerous night, Louis risked everything to pull Robert's older brother Jonathan out of enemy territory when their platoon was pinned down. Jonathan survived because of Louis's courage, but for reasons lost to time, the story had faded into the background, mentioned only in whispers at family gatherings. All these years later, Robert believed that fate, or maybe just a deep sense of responsibility, kept bringing their families together in moments that mattered. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Acts of sacrifice and bravery kept connecting the Thompsons and Ben's own family, generation after generation. Standing there, Ben started to see the silver wings he'd inherited as more than a badge of past achievements or burdens. They had become a living tradition, reminding him that true legacy is built on courage, empathy, and helping others even when the world is watching or no one at all will ever know. That sense of connection gave Ben new purpose, fueling his drive to keep pushing boundaries and making room for those who came next. On Thanksgiving Day, Ben's whole family gathered at his parents' house in Queens. The kitchen buzzed with familiar smells: roast turkey, sweet potatoes, and pumpkin pie. Cousins played video games upstairs while the older relatives swapped stories over. Coffee in the dining room. It was the type of gathering that always brought comfort, but this year a quiet tension seemed to linger just beneath the surface. After dinner, Ben's great-uncle Louis, long known as the quiet one in the family, cleared his throat and asked for everyone's attention. The room stilled as he began to tell his story. Louis talked about his secret military service during the Korean War, about how operations he was part of needed to be kept hidden, sometimes even from his own family. He described moments where his choices could have cost lives and how that responsibility weighed on him afterward. Louis explained that staying silent was not about shame or pride, but about protecting others. As the conversation unfolded, Other relatives opened up about their own choices, regrets, and small victories. For the first time, the burden of old secrets began to lift. Ben listened, realizing that every person in the room had been shaped by what was spoken, and even more, by what was not. He felt proud, finally able to wear the silver wings passed down to him, knowing exactly what they stood for. Not just past glory, but truth, courage, and the freedom to speak openly about where they had all come from. Several days after the family gathering, Ben sat alone in his dorm room at MIT, the heavy envelope from Robert Thompson resting on his desk. The urge to open the letter had been growing, but he waited until the campus was quiet and the pull of the past felt gentle, rather than overwhelming. As he slid the letter from its envelope, he noticed Frank's careful script, steady despite the years gone by. Reading Frank's words, Ben felt like he was looking across a great span of time and heartbreak. The letter spoke of pride in family, of the hope that one day a Wilson would find their own way and reach heights no one in their generation could have imagined. It mentioned regrets for opportunities that slipped away and a wish that future descendants wouldn't be held back by the same fears and barriers. There was encouragement, even a gentle instruction to dream boldly and trust that the weight of heritage could turn into wings for the next flight. When Ben finished, every doubt he had carried seemed lighter. The cycle of debts and expectations had been gently closed by someone who never got to say these things in person. With a new calm in his heart, Ben packed his bag for the walk back to the lab. He wasn't just returning to MIT, he was stepping forward with a sense of freedom, determined to make real change. The silver wings he wore now meant not only family honor, but a promise to keep forging ahead with innovation, courage, and fairness for himself and everyone who might follow.